All right, another couple of types of mobility are horizontal and vertical mobility. Um, Horizontal mobility is the occupational movement of individuals or groups within a social class, which is fairly common. We're talking about changing jobs within a class structure. A good example is a therapist who shifts careers so that he or she can teach college experiences. So that's an example of horizontal. Vertical social mobility is movement up or down the social ladder, and thus is often called upward or downward mobility. If the same therapist marries a president of a large corporation, he might experience upward mobility. On the other hand, if he or his wife gets laid off, he might experience downward mobility. We also have structural mobility, which refers to changes in the social status of large numbers of people due to structural changes in society. This can happen during things like economic recessions or expansions of higher education. Example of women entering the workplace during World War II is a good example of structural change. And during periods of economic recession, we may see downward social mobility. So with the women in World War II, we were seeing some upward social mobility, and then economic recessions create downward social mobility. Social mobility helps us make sense of how individuals' lives are shaped by a broader historical moment. That is, social mobility may be impacted by structural mobility. Think about C. Wright Mill's definition of sociology as the interaction of history and biography when you think about structural mobility. Another thing that we have to talk about is poverty. In the United States, the federal poverty line is frequently used to determine who should be characterized as poor. The poverty threshold in 2017 for a family of four was $24,000 or $24,600. And most people living in poverty are not unemployed. The fact is evident in the term working poor. They just aren't making enough money through the jobs they're doing to make ends meet. The number of people in poverty in the United States was 40.6 million, or 12.7% of the population in 2016. And individuals living below the poverty line are eligible to receive assistance. Welfare reform, of course, occurred in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, and so that type of assistance has changed significantly. But when you fall below the poverty line, that's when the government allows itself to step in. When we think about poverty, we're thinking about absolute and relative types of deprivation. Absolute deprivation is an objective measure of poverty that is defined by the inability to meet minimal standards for food, shelter, clothing, or healthcare. Relative deprivation, on the other hand, is a relational measure of poverty based on the standards of living. People are considered poor if their standard of living is less than that of other members of society. But that doesn't mean they're not able to feed themselves or shelter themselves. They're just poorer than the rest of society. This is an interesting graph here. We're looking at poverty in the United States by selected characteristics. As we can see, when we're thinking of race, who's the most impoverished? Black people are the most impoverished. Age, who's the most impoverished? Young people are the most impoverished. And sex, who's the most impoverished? Well, that's females are the most impoverished. And that's part of the stratification system that we have in place in the United States. When we think about poverty, some important concepts and issues were the culture of poverty and the invisibility of poverty. The culture of poverty refers to learned attitudes that can develop among poor communities and lead the poor to accept their fate rather than attempt to improve their situation. One of the key criticisms of this theory is that it tends to blame victims of poverty for their own misfortune while failing to take into account the structural factors that shape culture. Invisibility of poverty is residential segregation, political disenfranchisement, and the use of law enforcement to control the homeless and make poverty invisible to many Americans. And all of this brings into question the American dream. Is the ideology that anyone can achieve material success if he or she works hard enough actually true? Because this is the idea of meritocracy, that hard work is justly rewarded. This notion tells us that success or failure depends on the person, while in reality, we know that there are structural advantages and disadvantages that also contribute to an individual's success or failure. So, when we think of the American dream, it's exemplified in U.S. society by the rags to riches success stories. But we're not quite sure if this ideal still exists. When asking millennials whether they think the American dream still exists, 50% believe it does, and 50% believe it's dead. There are also differences in beliefs across racial groups. So, in conjunction with the American dream, the wealth gap should be discussed, which indicates that the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. This, of course, is due to an oligarchic situation that we have in the United States. And that oligarchy is relevant when we discuss the American dream and the wealth gap. Ultimately, the oligarchy occurs when a very few number of wealthy individuals rule a country, which make a lot of the mobility in our society not as prevalent.